This literature is so dense, man. Jesus is being identified as the fiery divine presence that Moses and Elijah met on the mountain. And what they were talking about was Jesus's, and it's the Greek word exodus.
The Apostle Paul often talked about the evil entities whose domains he violated in the wake of Pentecost. He understood the Old Testament's cosmic geography.
He's portraying this as an apocalypse, a revealing of Jesus's real identity.
Oh, wow.
On a mountaintop, because this is the place of theophany, of God revealing himself.
Until that day, God wants us to tell the epic story of his war against supernatural rebellion, to help him release those still held captive by unseen powers of darkness.
Welcome to another episode of Ring Them Bells. I'm going to take a second and ask you to subscribe. This is something really small for you, but it means a lot for the message and scope of this channel. If you can slap that like button, share this content out, make sure you're subscribed, turn on the alerts. All these little things help us get the message out about the good news about what God has done for this world.
One of the obvious items that comes up when I talk about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview is what scholars typically refer to as cosmic geography. It creates a theology of when Yahweh then turns around right after Babel and calls Abraham and promises him a land. That sets up really the rest of the Old Testament, frankly, the rest of the Bible, because you have then Israel, God's people, the descendants of Abraham, occupying this land. You have that play out very obviously in the New Testament in Pauline vocabulary. Now, Paul does use the word demons occasionally, but most of the time he talks about the powers of darkness. It's with terms like principalities, powers, rulers, thrones, dominions, authorities. And what they have in common is their terms of geographical dominion. And so Paul is getting his theology from this Old Testament stuff. And they're different than demons, but again, they have a common enemy. They're evil. They're all, part of the panoply of the powers of darkness. But the whole notion of attachment to specific regions and places is what's going on here. So you get these stories, Naaman the leper. Why does Naaman ask for dirt? It's because he knows that Yahweh is attached to this place. He's going to go back home to Syria. He's going to go back home and do his job, but he needs geography. He needs dirt on which to sacrifice and worship. Caesarea Philippi was also located at the base of Mount Hermon. In some of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Jesus' day, Mount Hermon was the place where the fallen sons of God descended to earth before the flood. Bashan and Hermon were ground zero for the cosmic evil powers. Jesus was standing at Satan's front door when he announced the gates of hell would not withstand the church.
In this place, Jesus asked Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered,
"You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
Jesus commended Peter and declared,
"I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it."
The identification of this rock has been debated for a very long time. The area's geography is the key to understanding this passage.
Eventually, this place became known as Pan's Grotto. The god Pan was represented with horns, a goat's beard, a crooked nose, pointed ears, a tail, and goat's feet. That's why the early church described the devil in those ways. In a few days, Jesus would take 3 disciples with him up into Mount Hermon and put the entire spiritual world on notice with the Transfiguration.
Jesus took along Peter and James and John and led them to a high mountain by themselves alone. And he was transfigured before them. And a cloud came, overshadowing them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him."
If there is one New Testament text which begs, in fact, demands that it be viewed through Old Testament spectacles, it's the Transfiguration of Jesus. As you might know, Matthew, Mark, as well as Luke, all three synoptics record the Transfiguration of Jesus, and they all have their own unique way of telling the story, and we'll compare some of those details as we work our way through the text. But the Transfiguration is just flooded with Old Testament images and themes and language and even people. So like a hyperlinked text where you have a link directing you to this place and this place and this place, that's the way the Transfiguration of Jesus is. It's hyperlinked to all of these Old Testament references, many of which we're going to be covering in this video.
Jesus is spreading the good news of God's kingdom. He's the Son of God, and this is how he's doing. He's doing it exactly the same way that God was up to in the storyline of the Hebrew Bible. So this tension keeps building and building until we get to chapter 9, and this is a moment parallel to Jesus' baptism again. And we're almost halfway through Luke's account. Not quite.
Okay.
So Luke chapter 9, verse 28. Some 8 days after saying what he just said before this, he took along Peter and John and James, and they went up onto a mountain to pray. So if you're keyed into the way Eden imagery works in the Hebrew Bible, back when Jesus went to a river, anytime you're in the presence of a river, you know that the River of Eden should be on your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And this might be some kind of Eden scene. Similarly, Eden is portrayed as being on a high hill, or what later biblical authors will call a mountain. And so he goes up onto a mountain to pray, to like commune with the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Which mountain, you might be asking? Well, that's up for debate. There's a couple of different possibilities that are usually put forward. In fact, other scholars will put forward more examples, but here are the two main contenders for the Mount of Transfiguration. One of these is Mount Hermon, which is up in the Golan Heights in far northern Israel. You can see a picture of that on the left. It's snow-covered. And in fact, when I was in Israel, it was still covered in snow just about 10 days ago. The other possibility is Mount Tabor, which is found in the Valley of Jezreel, and that is pictured on your right. So where exactly did this take place? We wouldn't know. Matthew tells us it was a very high mountain. Luke just says the mountain. So the location doesn't matter as far as which specific mountain. But that it takes place on a mountain is important. Didn't take place at the Jordan River. It didn't take place on a plain, but it took place on a mountain. Why? Well, because mountains, of course, are the places of divine epiphany. This is where God manifests himself. This is where God likes to do big things. Just look at the list on your screen. All the way back in Genesis 22, Mount Moriah is where Isaac is nearly sacrificed. And then you have David building an altar later on Mount Moriah. And then Solomon builds the temple on this very same spot on Mount Moriah. Mount Horeb, or known as also Mount Sinai, of course you know all about that. That's where the burning bush was. That's where God gave the Ten Commandments. That's where you have all these theophanies, both to Moses and, interestingly, Elijah. Mount Hor is where Aaron dies and his son becomes high priest in this place. You have the mountains of cursing and blessing in Gerizim and Abel. You have Mount Nebo, where Moses sees the promised land. And of course you have Zion, which is there at Jerusalem, that chosen city of God and foreshadowing of the church. And interestingly, there's another mountain. So we have all these other mountains where these significant things happen, but there's also an earlier mountain that we often forget about, and that is Mount Eden. So if you look on your screen, I have a number of biblical texts. We're not going to look at these in detail, but Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 2 and 11, Joel chapter 2, and then Ezekiel 40. All of these, in one way or another, describe the paradise of God where he placed Adam and Eve as a mountain. So we call it the Garden of Eden, but we could also call it the Garden of Mount Eden. So humanity begins on a mountaintop where God dwells, walks among his people. And so all the other mountains in Scripture are patterned where God reveals himself, where God does big things for his people. All of these are patterned after what happened on Mount Eden. So, of course, when Jesus is going to have his transfiguration, he doesn't go to the Jordan River. He doesn't go to a valley. He goes on a mountaintop because this is the place of theophany, of God revealing himself.
So while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothing became white and flashing. Like, basically, he becomes like a source of light. And there were two humans talking with him. One was Moses, and one was Elijah. And they also appeared in like glorious splendor. And what they were talking about was Jesus's, and it's the Greek word exodus, exodos. They were talking about the exodus he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. So let's just pause right there. Like there's a lot happening right there.
So why would Jesus look this way? Well, to know why he looked this way, we have to, again, go back to the Old Testament and look at several different examples of how this kind of appearance, both with regard to the face, as with regard to the clothing, was a manifestation of a heavenly reality. So the main one is Exodus 34:39. This is the well-known instance of the face of Moses shining as a result of speaking with God on the mountain. I think that is the primary background of why Jesus' face shone this way. He's being shown to be the greater Moses, the one who's the prophet, talked about it in Deuteronomy 18. Also, in Ezekiel 1, and we're going to look at this in more detail in just a minute, the man on the throne in Ezekiel's vision was like glowing metal and fire. And then further in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, the Ancient of Days has clothing as white as snow, and his hair is like pure wool. And then in Psalm 104:2, God covers himself with light as with a garment. Now, this translation as dazzling white or clothing as bright as a lightning flash, why is that significant? Well, especially in the reference to the white clothing, this tells us this is a heavenly kind of a garment, if you will, that Jesus is wearing, because he himself is heavenly. He is divine. The word that's translated as dazzling is ex astrapto, which can mean a flash or gleam like lightning, like a lightning strike in the sky with its white appearance, bright appearance. But the white part, lukos in Greek, that is referenced several times in the New Testament, where you have heavenly figures, mainly angels, wearing white clothing. So Luke 9:29 talks about how Jesus' clothes were dazzling white. But then in Acts 1, we have at the ascension of Jesus, two men standing by the disciples, and they're wearing white robes. These are the angels who tell them, don't go looking up into heaven. This same Jesus is going to come down from heaven. In Mark's account of the resurrection, in the empty tomb, there was a young man sitting on the right side dressed in a white robe. And then you go to Revelation chapter 19, and it talks about the armies of heaven. And what are they wearing? They're wearing fine linen, white and pure, and even their horses are white. So the white appearance of Jesus' clothing, white as a flash of lightning, is an indication, of course, that he is not just a man, but that he is a heavenly being. In fact, his clothing are as white as they are, and his face is shining, not because of some external glory like the face of Moses, but instead of an internal glory. This is the manifestation of the fact that the humanity of Jesus is also divine. He's not only man, he is God. And so the Transfiguration is a unveiling of that, a revelation or epiphany of his divine identity. He's a man, to be sure, but he's also fully divine. Now, let's go back to that Ezekiel text that I referred to a second ago. In Ezekiel 1:26-28, there is the manifestation to Ezekiel of this divine chariot throne that's borne by the cherubim. Now, look in particular at how the man on this throne is described. Ezekiel says that seated above the likeness of the throne was a likeness with a human appearance. Kamar'e Adam in Hebrew, the likeness of a man. And then it describes him in more detail. Upwards from what had the appearance of his waist, there was this gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire. And then he goes on to say that downward from his waist, there was the appearance of fire, this brightness around him. And then we have reference to the rainbow that was around him. And this one who was man-like, who had this human appearance, is called the glory of the Lord, the kavod Yahweh. Now, this manifestation of a man-like glory of God on the divine throne, this is, in fact, the Son of God. And now, on the Mount of Transfiguration, he once more appears in this dazzling, bright, sun-like sort of way.
Mm-hmm. So the Moses and Elijah thing isn't incidental. It's actually really key to the claim about Jesus' identity here.
Yeah, so Moses was this very significant leader who was like the closest to the image of God we kind of find in the Hebrew Bible, it seems like.
Mm-hmm. He was also a second-born.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Elevated to that privileged experience. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, tell me about Elijah.
Well, Elijah is, in the narratives about him, especially in 1 Kings chapter 17 to 19, is portrayed as a new Moses-type figure. Both Moses and Elijah, they're the only two people that ever ascend Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Both encounter the divine presence in fire and cloud and have conversations with God on the top of the same mountain with the same kind of manifestations of power. So I think the claim, the shock factor, really is if you get the hyperlinks here. So Moses and Elijah are the two figures in the Hebrew Bible. They also represent the two big parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, Moses, and the prophets, Elijah. And they're the two people, they're the two figures who encountered the fire, cloud, flashing presence of Yahweh and talked with that presence on the top of the mountain. And so what Luke is doing is he's portraying this as an apocalypse, a revealing of Jesus's real identity.
Oh, wow.
And he puts Jesus in the slot of the divine Yahweh fire presence that Moses and Elijah met on Mount Sinai.
Whoa. Okay. I've never had it put that explicitly to me before.
Now, Jesus also, as he does so, he becomes a gleaming human image of God's glory.
Right.
Which is what the high priest of Israel symbolized and represented.
Yeah.
As a gleaming, glowing figure dressed in white going into the Holy of Holies. But Moses and Elijah didn't meet Aaron on top of Mount Sinai. They met the one that Aaron is an image of, namely the fiery presence of Yahweh.
Yeah.
That Moses and Elijah show up, which is just simply astonishing. Why are they there? What significance do they have? Well, there's a number of possibilities, and maybe it's probably just kind of a combination of all of these. Number one, both these guys have close ties with a theophany at Mount Sinai and a speech from God. Of course, you're probably familiar with what happened with Moses on Mount Sinai, but remember that Elijah, after his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, he flees to Sinai, where he too has a theophany, and God speaks to him. So both Moses and Elijah are connected with a mountaintop where there is theophanic speech. Number two, both these guys also have unusual departures from this world. Elijah's taken up in that chariot of fire. Moses dies, we're told, but God secretly buries his body. Third, Elijah formed part of the end-time expectation of the first century Jews. So it was expected that Elijah would be the one who heralds the coming of the Messiah. And of course, we hear more about this in connection with John the Baptist in the New Testament. And then finally, and this is what you'll mainly hear referenced, and I think it's a legitimate reason, I just don't think it's the only reason, and that is that Moses is the embodiment of the Torah, often called the law, but it's the Torah, and Elijah of the prophets. And so when you have Moses with the Torah and Elijah with the prophets together, that basically means you got the entire Old Testament represented in these two men bearing witness that Jesus is the Messiah. So Moses and Elijah are basically saying the Old Testament, everything that's written in the Old Testament is pointing toward this one with whom we are now conversing. Now, there's one cool thing about this with regard to Moses and Elijah, and then also Peter, James, and John. This is a quote from St. Ephraim, the Syrian, a well-known early church poet and hymn writer. He says, at the Transfiguration, the prophets, that is Moses and Elijah, the prophets rejoiced because they had seen Christ's humanity, which they had not known. So they didn't know his humanity in the Old Testament, but they rejoice now that they've seen it. And, Ephraim goes on, the apostles, Peter, James, and John, rejoiced because they had seen the glory of his divinity, which they had not known. So each of them, in their own way, are seeing something new. The Old Testament people are seeing the humanity of Jesus, and the New Testament people are seeing the divinity of Jesus. So these two groups are seeing something new comprised, put together in this one man.
So that's remarkable. So Peter and his companions, fascinating, they were overcome with sleep, which might seem like the opposite of what I would be feeling if I was there.
Yeah, is this like they saw it and they're like, that's cool, but I'm tired? Or were they already sleeping?
It's a good question. It's been a long time since I've dove into the Greek of this account, because whether or not the sleep is portrayed as happening, it might be that it's saying like this was all happening while they were going to sleep, which is significant because what it means is they were in a dream state. And dream states are connected to visions, dreams and visions.
Apocalypses.
Yeah, and apocalypses. Apocalypses happen when our normal level of human consciousness gets subverted, right? Or our normal ways of seeing reality get surrendered when we are functioning at a deeper level of consciousness, awareness. And I think that's what we're meant to see here. This was an apocalyptic vision, a lot like what Jesus saw in the baptism.
But then they're told to be fully awake, and they're still seeing this. So
Exactly, totally.
it's happening. It's not like in their imagination. Like it's happening.
No, that's right, exactly. But that's the thing about these altered states of consciousness and dreams and visions. In other words, for us, when we think of dreams and visions, we think of you're seeing something that's only half real. And the biblical authors have the exact opposite assumption, which is it's when
we're
you're
walking through life seeing half real.
Yes.
And there's moments where we get a revealing, an apocalypse of what's really going on.
That's right, of what's truly real. And that's what this is.
What are they talking about? When I talk about the Transfiguration, this is actually a question that comes up quite often. So they were talking, but what are they talking about? Well, if you look at Matthew, you don't know. If you look at Mark, you don't know. Luke is the only gospel writer who tells us the subject that they are discussing. And that is, they are talking about his Exodus, which the ESV and many other English translations render inadequately, in my opinion, as departure. Now, Exodus can mean departure. If you look in 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter speaks of his departure, which in Greek is his exodus, his departure from this life. But most of the references in the Greek translation of the Old Testament are in reference to the, capital T, the Exodus from Egypt. So if you go back to, for instance, Exodus 19, verse 1, we read that in the 3rd month of the Exodus, the departure of the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, on that same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Skip forward to 1 Kings chapter 6. This is the time of the building of the temple under Solomon. And once more, it came to pass in the 440th year after the Exodus, the departure of the children of Israel out of Egypt. That's when Solomon began to build the temple. Well, what does this mean? They're talking about his Exodus, his departure. Well, what it means is that what he's going to do in Jerusalem, what Christ is going to Jerusalem, as we'll hear soon after this in Luke's gospel, he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. Why? Because it's in Jerusalem that he is going to bring about this Exodus that the prophets over and over talked about, a worldwide Exodus for all humanity in which the lost, banished, exiled children of Adam and Eve are going to be brought home to God. And Jesus accomplishes this in the Exodus of his crucifixion, where he goes into the far-away country of death itself. When his body is placed in the grave, Jesus fully has gone into exile. That is the moment of exile, in darkness and death. And then 3 days later, when he emerges from the grave, this is his exodus from death. He's returning from the exodus of death. And when Christ steps out of the grave, he bears all humanity on his shoulders. What this one man does, he does for all humanity. So when he dies, we all die. When he's buried, we're all buried. When he rises, we all are raised. That's the exodus that Jesus brings to pass in Jerusalem. His exodus for us and for all humanity.
So they see all of this, and they saw his glory, Jesus' royal splendor, and the two guys standing with him. Mm-hmm. So Peter comes up with this idea that, oh man, we need to make some tabernacles.
Yeah, this is such a weird, part of the story for me.
Yeah, but what did the tabernacle in the Hebrew Bible, what did it host? It hosted the divine presence.
Oh, okay.
But now he's seeing three glorious presences.
Yeah, he wants to set up camp for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Luke says, after Peter says, let's make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then Luke says, he didn't know what he was talking about.
The Greek word for tent is skene. If you look in the Old Testament translation in Greek, the Septuagint, that is how the tabernacle is described. So tabernacle is a fancy word for tent. There's also a feast called the Feast of Tents, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. It's known by all those names. This is the third of the annual feast of the Jews. You have Passover, Pentecost, and then you have tabernacles, or booths, or Sukkot, in the fall. This is the festival at which Israelites go to Jerusalem. They live in these temporary leafy shelters, these temporary tents, tabernacles, as a way of commemorating the time when their mothers and fathers, their forefathers and their foremothers, were in the wilderness for 40 years. So every time they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, this is a time in which they remember that life of wandering in the Exodus. Many scholars, and I tend to agree with this as well, think that what is being alluded to here is Peter wants to, as it were, celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. He's going to make these 3 tents for Moses and for Elijah and for Jesus, and they're going to have this end-time celebration, if you will. Peter, as Luke tells us, doesn't know what he's talking about, but he is onto something because he's picking up the tabernacle, the tent language. And we're going to hear in just a minute that Peter is mistaken. We don't need a tabernacle for Moses and for Jesus and for Elijah because we have a new tabernacle. We have a new tent. And it's not a tent-like structure. It's a flesh and blood man. Christ is the tabernacle. Christ is the one in whom the glory of God dwells.
So it gets even crazier. While Peter was talking, a cloud came and overshadowed them. So now they're in heaven, right? They are all of a sudden swept up into the heavens in the form of this cloud as they enter the cloud. And a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." So this whole scene is a replay of the baptism, but now there's other witnesses, and Jesus' identity is kind of explored even more in parallelism to the implications of what the voice said. In other words, this scene is kind of filling out what you should have got from the baptism, but now it's filling it out with even more hyperlinks. And so notice Jesus's status as the Son is front and center right here.
Yeah.
And he's the chosen Son. In the baptism, he was called the beloved Son. Now he's called the chosen Son, which is another word from the servant poems in Isaiah, in the scroll of Isaiah, the chosen one.
And listen to him, is that connected to Shema?
Yeah.
Listen.
Oh, this is rad. Actually, that phrase comes from, it's a hyperlink to Deuteronomy chapter 18, when Moses says, "One day God is going to raise up a prophet like me from among the people. Listen to him." So he's being identified. Dude, this literature is so dense, man. Jesus is being identified as the fiery divine presence that Moses and Elijah met on the mountain.
That's wild.
That took up residence in the tabernacle. He's being portrayed as the high priest, as the one that the high priest symbolized with the white clothes in the middle of the divine glory. And he's being portrayed as the son of Psalm 2, the king from the line of David, the chosen one, that's from the servant poems in the book of Isaiah, and of the prophet like Moses who is to come from the Torah. Just like, dude, so dense. And then once the voice spoke, Jesus was alone. Everyone was silent. It was over.
This is why you have to go back to all the Old Testament references. The mountain, Moses and Elijah, the speech, the clouds, the glory, it's all lifted. This language is lifted from the thesaurus of the Old Testament. So we have the cloud appearing here. Well, this in your mind, go back to all the appearances of God in connection with clouds. I've got a list of them on your screen. God led Israel by a cloud pillar in Exodus 13. We have the glory of God appearing in a cloud in Exodus 16. God descends on Mount Sinai in a thick cloud in Exodus 19. When Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, this cloud covers the mountain in Exodus 24. We just looked at Exodus 40, where the glory cloud, episkiazo, overshadowed the tabernacle. Isaiah in in chapter 4 predicts when a cloud and fire will cover Zion. And then Ezekiel says that he has this vision of a great cloud with fire flashing. So when God shows up, when a cloud shows up in a theophany, the cloud is God's clothing. He's wearing the cloud so that he can't be seen, but the cloud is the icon of his presence. It shows us that God has shown up. And God did not only show up, he's about to speak. And what does he say? Well, what he says is drawn from various parts of the Old Testament. It's a conglomeration of various texts into one statement. This is what is known as metalepsis. We've talked about that many other times in these videos, where a New Testament author, or sometimes an Old Testament author, will quote or allude to an earlier text, and you're expected to go from there. To use the hyperlink example, you click on it, and it takes you back to an earlier text. And you compare the earlier text and the later text, and you let these talk with one another so that you learn more fully what is being communicated. So we have various layers of metalepsis here. Let's take a look at them. First of all, God says, "This is my son, huiasmu." That is taken from Psalm 2, verse 7, that messianic psalm about the anointed one, the king. And here we read, "He said to me," that is, the Lord said to me, the Messiah, "You are my son." The Greek there is identical between what God says at the Transfiguration and then what is said in Psalm 2. Also, my chosen, the chosen one. That's the exact language used in Isaiah 42, verse 1. The servant, the messianic servant. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom my soul delights." So not only is he the chosen one of God, he's also, not only is he the Son of God, he's also the chosen one of God. And then the third reference to an Old Testament text is "listen to him," or "to him listen." Autou akuete. This is a direct quote from Deuteronomy 18:15. That's where Moses predicts a prophet who will come after him. And what are the people to do when this prophet comes who's like Moses? They are to listen to him. The Greek is the exact same between Deuteronomy 18:15 and the Transfiguration account, except for the tense. So Moses says, "You shall listen to him." And here, God says, "To him, listen." Because, of course, there's no more future. He's here. The prophet has arrived.
So what all of Luke 4 through 9 is taking you on a journey of the baptism was Jesus being commissioned in light of his full identity. Then you watched him acting on that identity as God's ultimate cosmic firstborn son. And everybody's got questions. The spiritual beings seem to know exactly who he is. And now he just brings a small circle of his closest followers, and they get an apocalypse of his identity as the cosmic son, glory of God.
Wow.
Powerful stuff, man.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's something that clicked for me a while ago, and it was actually as I was working in the Gospel of John for a Bible Project Classroom class that we're going to be doing in the next year and a half or so on the Gospel of John. And I realized that what Luke is trying to communicate about who Jesus is through hyperlinks and narrative patterning from the Hebrew Bible, but the claim that Jesus is the human embodiment of the divine glory that took up residence in Israel's tabernacle and temple, that is exactly the same claim that John is making about Jesus in the gospel, but just more explicitly.
Yeah. You're talking about in John 1.
From beginning to end. Yeah, so actually that's kind of where I want to go next to kind of just conclude this part of the conversation. But this is really significant, at least to me, that Luke is using narrative strategy to communicate something about the identity of Jesus. But you have to know how he's communicating to pick up the signals.
Yeah.
And I think this is why when it comes to understanding Jesus' divine identity in the New Testament, why John seems easier to see that that's what he's saying than in the other Gospels. But it's really just about the different narrative techniques these authors were using, because they're all communicating the same thing.
If at the birth of Jesus, we learn that God has now become man, then at the transfiguration of Jesus, we learn that this man is also God, has remained God, and will always be God. He's what the Greek fathers called theanthropos, the God-man. Divinity, humanity in one, fully God, fully man. He is the one on whom all of our hopes, all of our desires, everything is focused. And at the Transfiguration, on this mountaintop, we have a window into his identity. He goes from there to the cross, but he goes through the cross and the empty tomb in his exodus to bring us forth into freedom and redemption and into a life of hope and love.
Right after Jesus did these things at the gates of hell and Mount Hermon, he began to teach his disciples that he needed to go to Jerusalem to die. The thought panicked them. They didn't understand. But Jesus knew it was time to fulfill God's plan.
Hope you guys are enjoying this series. We have so much left to explore. I just wanted to take a quick second and ask you to subscribe. This channel is growing rapidly, and I am so grateful for the reach that God is giving it. But I pray that we can go even further with the message and the good news of what God has done for this world. So please like, please share, please subscribe. Help us get the good news out there. Let's get back to the message.
A week later, Jesus arrived in Jerusalem for his triumphal entry. Jesus' provocations of the supernatural powers led to the devil striking back. Satan entered Judas, whose betrayal in the garden led to Jesus' trial. He stood accused before the high priest, Caiaphas, who demanded that he defend himself.
The high priest said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God, that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God."
Jesus' claim to be God was enough for the priest to declare that he should die, and die he did. Psalm 22 gives us a glimpse of the suffering Messiah on the cross.
All who see me mock me. They open wide their lips. They shake the head, saying, "He trusts Yahweh. Let him rescue him." Many bulls have encircled me. Mighty bulls of Bashan have surrounded me. They open their mouth against me, like a lion, tearing and roaring. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me.
The creepy part is the description of the mighty bulls of Bashan. Remember that Bashan was known as ground zero to demonic gods and the realm of the dead. The area was a leading center for the worship of Baal, symbolized by bulls and cows. Mighty bulls of Bashan refers to demons and the powers of darkness.
C.S. Lewis captured the force of the psalm in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. No one can forget when Aslan surrenders his life to the hordes of the White Witch and dies on the stone table. But just as Aslan outsmarted the White Witch, so too Jesus turned this apparent defeat into the greatest triumph of all time.
Jesus triumphed over death. He was granted authority over all things. Satan has no claim over God's people. Jesus conquered death through his resurrection. Now we know from what Paul says in Acts 17. I mean, Paul had an inkling that, okay, this is somehow, the fixing of the boundaries of the nations was somehow going to be part of God's plan for bringing people to the knowledge of the true God and ultimately to the gospel. And again, Paul has this inkling. Well, again, think about the Old Testament logic. What God does is he divorces them. And then he says, okay, I'm going to show you how it was supposed to be done. I've divorced all of you, so now I need a new people. Okay, I'm going to go over to this guy, Abraham in Ur, and I'm going to call him, and he's too old to have kids, and his wife's too old to have kids, but now watch. Okay, I'm going to raise up for myself my own inheritance. Jacob is my allotted heritage. Israel is my portion on the planet. I've consigned the rest of you under the authority of other lesser Elohim. Hopefully they will rule according to my justice. They'll be like me. Hopefully you will be able to look at my people now, Israel, as what life would be like if you were living in relationship to me. And if my people follow the law, they'll be happy. They'll have good lives. I will bring them to a land. They'll enjoy life. That land is now sort of a mini Eden or a new Eden. At least it's supposed to be, because I'm there. I'm there. Heaven is going to meet earth again. I will occupy that space. That will be sacred space. They will be a kingdom of priests between me and you. And they're supposed to attract you back to wanting a relationship with me, not one of these other guys. In Psalm 82, the gods become corrupt. They seduce the Israelites into worshiping them. The whole thing, just sort of blows up because humans are wicked. Because they are corrupted, again, by other forces, outside of their own nature. And we have a lot working against us, okay? But this was the plan. This is the rest of the biblical story. This is why it's Israel against the nations. It's why it's Yahweh against the gods. Because this relationship deteriorates into one of hostility and antipathy. It becomes a turf war. This is why when Paul talks about the forces of darkness, he uses the word demons a few times. He does that when he quotes Deuteronomy 32. But look at his vocabulary. Principalities, powers, rulers, authorities, thrones, dominions. They all have one thing in common. They are all terms used in other contexts of geographical dominion. Okay? Paul uses it because that's what the Old Testament worldview is. That's the worldview he inherits. Daniel 10, attaching divine beings, princes, prince of Persia, prince of Greece, to what's going on geopolitically down here. This is the Old Testament worldview. But it's rivalry. It's antipathy, it's hostility. It's not what it's supposed to be.
The Apostle Paul often talked about the evil entities whose domains he violated in the wake of Pentecost. He understood the Old Testament's cosmic geography.
Paul lists rulers and principalities, authorities, powers, dominions, lords, and thrones. All of these terms indicate geographical rulership. They reflect how the Old Testament depicts the relationship of the unseen and the seen worlds. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. He knew that he was up against the old gods of the nations, allotted to people, excluded from God's family back at Babel.
Paul says something in the book of Romans that helps us see that what happened at Babel influenced the way he thought about his mission.
Therefore, after I have accomplished this and sealed this fruit for delivery to them, I will depart by way of you for Spain.
Why did Paul care about getting to Spain? On the one hand, some think it's the only disinherited nation not mentioned in the book of Acts, the land of Tarshish. Clement, the early church father from the end of the 1st century AD, says that Paul went to the limits of the West in order to reach the full scope of Gentiles in the Roman Empire.
Having taught righteousness to the whole world and having come to the limits of the West.
In other words, Jonah went to Tarshish to get away from proclaiming to Gentiles in Nineveh. Paul went to Spain to reach the Gentiles at the end of the earth, called the Roman Empire.
God knew that the Great Commission was bigger than just Paul could imagine. It falls to us to bring the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth.
Paul had a supernatural view of his own life. He viewed himself as set apart, as an instrument for God's use. We have the same task of invading the demonic strongholds of this world with the message of the love of Jesus Christ.
Remember our discussion of holy and unholy ground. You might wonder where God's presence is today. And sure, the Bible teaches us God is everywhere. But it actually marks his presence more specifically.
Paul writes that God is specifically present within each believer. In other words, every believer is sacred space.
God was present in the temple. Today, the same is true wherever believers gather as a group. The Bible says the people of God are collectively God's temple.
You are fellow citizens of the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. You also are built up together into a dwelling place of God in the Spirit.
Together, we are God's temple, the special place where God's Spirit resides. Wherever believers gather, the spiritual ground we occupy is sanctified amid the powers of darkness.
Being partakers of the divine nature means we will be like God. We will have a body like Jesus did after the resurrection. We will have eternal life, and with the loyal members of the heavenly host, we will be in God's family and worship Him forever. God will succeed in uniting His divine and human family for eternity. But the most amazing part of being in God's family is how Jesus, the unique Son of God, sees us. When Jesus became a man, He was made for a short time a little lower than the angels. Listen to the writer to the Hebrews.
But now, we do not yet see all things subjected to Him, but we see Jesus, for a short time made lower than the angels, so that apart from God, He might taste death on behalf of everyone.
Because God became man in Jesus, His mortal followers will become like Him and members of God's family. We are Jesus' siblings and the fruit of His ministry.
He is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers. In the midst of the assembly, I will sing in praise of you. And again, behold, I am the children God has given me.
It's stunning that Jesus is not ashamed to call mere mortals His brothers and sisters. In fact, in the presence of the divine council, He revels in introducing God to us and us to God.
Consider the reason that Paul gives for our glorification.
Because those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, so that He should be the firstborn among many brothers.
The exaltation of Jesus is the reason for our glorification. He is the firstborn, or the head, the one who receives the inheritance among many brothers. Until that day, God wants us to tell the epic story of His war against supernatural rebellion, to help Him release those still held captive by unseen powers of darkness.
Still got so much to share and learn. I hope you guys are subscribed. I want to close us out with a quick prayer. Father God, thank you for this channel. Thank you for this series. Thank you for revealing yourself and giving us dirt creatures an understanding of you, this cosmic being. Father, let that learning about you humble us, to unite us, to understand that none of us have it all figured out and that we need you. We need your Son. We need your Spirit. We need you to unite us in our minds and in our understanding. I pray for this channel that it can be a light for those that are out there to understand you. I pray that you'll continue to open my eyes and open my mind and heart to the truths of your word so that I can share it with your people. Please, Father, send your Spirit. Help us. We need you. Remove temptation from us. Deliver us from the power of the evil one, and we will rejoice and glorify your name as it is glorified. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.